I'm very pleased to be here this evening and to have been invited to this special function. I thank Professor Gideon Pogrand for inviting me to join you and to give this address on the occasion of the launch of the Anti-Corruption Working Guide for South African Companies. It is normal for a speaker to say at the beginning of their speech that they are honored and privileged to have been invited to speak. However, I feel truly honored and privileged to have been invited to this function, where the Center for Business Ethics launches the Anti-Corruption Working Guide for South African Companies. I say I feel especially honored to have been invited to this launch because it seems to me that the launch of this very important guide is part of this institution's response to the report of the State Capture Commission that I had the honor to chair. Not only that, it is also part, it seems to me, of the response of the business sector to the report of the Commission. In his letter to me of 31 May 2023, Professor Pogrand told me that at the Center for Business Ethics, their purpose is to influence South African business to behave ethically and thereby help ensure a more sustainable future for the business community and the country. He told me that they were working already towards, they were preparing a guide on how business can more effectively combat corruption. In my first or second media briefing after the announcement of my appointment as the chairperson of the State Capture Commission in 2018, I was asked by a journalist to state what the scope or mandate of the commission was. And I said that it was to establish whether state capture had happened, to establish who were involved in state capture, to establish what had caused state capture and the extent of state capture, as well as what measures should be put in place to make sure that state capture never happened again. Of course, as we all know, it's over a year since the Commission handed its report to the President. And after the Commission's report had been handed to the President, the question that arose was, what was going to happen now that the Commission had completed its work and had handed its report? What was going to happen to its recommendations? What was going to happen to its findings? I do not propose to deal with its findings, but I do want to say a very important part of the mandate of the Commission was to look at what measures needed to be put in place to make sure that if there was state capture, it didn't happen again. What, of course, we didn't know at the time was that the state capture that the Commission would find would not be limited to the Guptas, but that there would be state capture that was perpetrated by other companies. Of course, the report of the Commission revealed that long before the Guptas engaged in state capture, Busasa had already captured the Department of Correctional Services in particular. And of course, reference was made in the discussion after I had come in here to Bain at SARS, which had nothing to do with the Guptas, which also captured SARS. And you will see when you look at SARS and you look at Busasa and you look at the state capture of the Guptas, that one of the common features was the head of state that was involved with those companies. You will recall that in terms of the recommendations of the Commission, One of the recommendations that was made was that there should be a public procurement anti-corruption agency. Now, for me, that recommendation is one of the most important recommendations that the Commission made, because most of the corruption that takes place in the context of public procurement. Therefore, if in terms of public procurement, corruption could be reduced even by 30%, that could make a big difference. And the public procurement anti-corruption agency that was recommended by the Commission contemplates that it would have a number of units. And one of the units that it would have, I used to say when the Commission was going on, would be like traffic cops who could come into any government department anytime and even unannounced and demand to see certain documents relating to tenders in order to make sure that if they have been given information by whistleblowers, they can stop corruption before the public loses money. The substance of the President's response to that recommendation was positive. So we hope that in due course, there will be this body that will specialize in fighting corruption in relation to procurement. Of course, another recommendation that was made related to Parliament, because the Gupta state capture had taken place because Parliament had failed to stop it when it could have stopped it. So that is something that even Parliament acknowledges. That is something that is common cause now. But what is important is what is to be done to make sure that it doesn't happen again. One of the things that I've raised before is that in those instances where Parliament might not carry out its function of oversight and of holding the executive accountable, we had recommended a commission that would be a standing commission that would be like the commission that I chaired. That would be a standing commission that would be permanent, so that whenever Parliament did not do its job and that posed a risk to a state capture and corruption, then that commission could step in and call whoever may have information, ministers, president, MPs, directors general, call them to the commission and ask them all the difficult questions that maybe members of Parliament might not have been prepared to ask them, and ask them in the full glare of the cameras, and the public can see and hear all the answers exactly like the commission that I chaired did. Of course, as I understand it, that is still under consideration by the President in order to see whether that commission can fit into the plan of the structures that he has in mind will be used in order to continue the fight against corruption and state capture. One of the measures also that the Commission looked at as measures that must be considered by the government in order to try and ensure that the levels of corruption in this country are brought down was the issue of the protection of whistleblowers. There are 2 or 3 pillars that characterize an effective fight against corruption. One is those who may be tempted to engage in corruption must know that there are very good chances that they will be found out. 2, they must know that once they have been found out, there will be serious adverse consequences. And the way to make sure that they will be found out is to make sure that whistleblowers are protected and that they are given incentives in order to blow the whistle. As you will have seen in the commission report, not only did we recommend that there should be strong protection for whistleblowers, but we also recommended that there should be incentives for whistleblowers. I have seen that in the anti-corruption working guide that is being launched today, there is a recommendation that business must look at establishing a fund to assist whistleblowers. I agree completely with that recommendation. Indeed, in one of my public speeches recently, I did say that the private sector should consider setting up a fund. Let us not wait for government. Government will do what it will do. But I think that private sector can easily set up such a fund. And a lot of people who love this country, a lot of people who hate corruption will be prepared to even make donations. I want to encourage the business sector to go ahead with that fund. And if it is a fund in which the public can make donations, I will be one of the first ones to make a donation from my own pocket because it is very important. I see the anti-corruption working guide that is being launched today as a way of the business sector saying to this country, we are prepared to roll up our sleeves and fight corruption. We are not simply going to talk and criticize, but we want to do something about it. And I think that the establishment of a fund will go a long way. The whistleblowers are subjected to all kinds of hardships. When they have blown the whistle, they get fired from work. They get faced with legal challenges, and they have no money to pay lawyers. And the fund that I think should be established is a fund that should be able to take care of all of those things and more. But I think that we should start with the whistleblowers that we already know in our country who helped us find out about state capture. There are many of them who are mentioned in the report, and many lost quite a lot because they lost their jobs. And others were not whistleblowers, but they were simply not prepared to be party to wrongdoing. And because they were standing in the way of those who were pursuing the agenda of state capture, they were suspended, they were dismissed. At SAA, that happened. At Neal, that happened. At NECOM, that happened. We do need whistleblowers. We don't want those who have blown the whistle in the past and helped this country in terms of state capture and other corruption to take the attitude that they will never again blow the whistle. Because when they have done so before, we have not come to their rescue. We don't want others who may have been prepared to blow the whistle to say, we will not blow the whistle. Because when we look at those who have blown the whistle during the years of state capture, we see that they were left alone. They were just people who talked highly of them, praised their deeds, but actually didn't do anything to assist them practically with the consequences that they suffered of blowing the whistle. Some, when they look for jobs, they tell us that once it is known that they have blown the whistle, they are whistleblowers, they don't get employed. I want to challenge the business sector today and say, why shouldn't you say those are the ones we want in our employ? Those are the ones we want in our employ. After all, you have nothing to fear because you are not pursuing any agenda of state capture or corruption. But by coming to the assistance of whistleblowers, you will be making a serious contribution to the fight against corruption. I want to applaud this center and the business people who were involved in discussions that have led to the launch of this guide. Because the launch of this guide comes at a time when, as a nation, we are called upon to reflect. We are about 7 months away from completing the third decade of our democracy. We are 29 years from 1994. And we should begin to ask the question ahead of completing the third decade. We know how the past 29 years of this country have been. And we know that many of those years have seen levels of corruption in this country going up, and of course, state capture. How do we want the next 30 years of this country to be? And whatever it is that we want this country to be in the next 30 years, it can only be what we want it to be if we are prepared to work hard to make it happen. If we are prepared to make the sacrifices that are called upon in order for us to achieve a South Africa that is different from the South Africa that is characterized by high levels of corruption and state capture. We need, at this time, as we approach the completion of the third year of our democracy, to identify exactly what the things are that have characterized our past, which mustn't happen in the next 30 years. We need to envisage the South Africa that we want to have in 2050. That South Africa mustn't be characterized by corruption and state capture. That South Africa must be a much better South Africa. But it is going to be up to you and me and all of us, having identified the measures that need to be put in place and the sacrifices that need to be made in order to achieve that South Africa. It's going to take all of us to do all of those things in order to achieve that South Africa. We cannot afford the same South Africa as we have seen during the years of state capture. We cannot afford to see it getting worse, actually. But if we have not identified what needs to be done, and we are not prepared to make the sacrifices that need to be done in order to make sure that the South Africa that our children and our grandchildren will have in 2050 will be a better South Africa, then we may as well forget I'm very happy about this anti-corruption working guide for South African companies. It is, in my view, the beginning of the journey for business to say, in 2050, in 2060, by that time, we want to have reduced the levels of corruption in South Africa drastically. And this guide, if used effectively, is going to make a serious contribution to that. I'm very encouraged by the measures that have been taken at SARS to recognize the suffering of workers that were subjected to a lot of suffering during the years of state capture. I'm very encouraged by the attitude that says the employer should do something when something like that has happened to some of its employees. I hope that many companies will follow this guide. And if they follow it, I have no doubt that they will make a serious contribution in the fight against corruption. Thank you.